Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show, we ask the question, can the modern-day Muslim women practice their divinely given rights?
Many Westerners believe Muslim women, whether living in the first or third worlds, are not as protected or respected as non-Muslim women. These thoughts are reinstated with images and stories coming out of conservative Muslim nations, showing women veiled from head to toe, shunned from the community, and abused by their male counterparts. Thus, the issue of whether Muslim women hold rights has been echoed through the winds of time. Although the religion of Islam has outlined divinely given rights for women, many of these rights are not usually implemented, and thus Muslim women have been prevented from reaching their full rights. This week's Islam and Life asks, can the modern-day Muslim woman practice her divinely given rights?
Very often when we speak about women in Islam, we speak about the discussion, a dialogue between the West, or the so-called West, and the Muslim majority countries. When it comes to the real situation within Muslim majority countries and within the Muslim communities, we still have to ask some questions, because there is something that we can find, and there are principles that we can find in the scriptural sources, the Quran, the revelation of the prophetic traditions, and it's something else to deal with what the Muslims themselves are doing in Muslim majority countries when it comes to very narrow understanding, very biased and cultural projection that are made on the text. And this is where is beyond the discussion between Islam and the West. We really need to come to a discussion within Islam among Muslims and to try to understand what is wrong in our interpretations. Why do we have this problem? And then also, of course, to come to the discussion with the West, with something which is much more articulated as to the diversity of views among Muslims, because this is also something which is important. There is not only one answer coming from Muslims, there are many answers coming from scholars, coming from societies, coming from trends within the Muslim communities and the Muslim majority countries. And these are the questions that we have to ask. Why these discriminations? What is wrong, and in which way things could be changed, and if or not they are improving on the ground? And these are also questions that we have to tackle and try to think about. And to answer all these questions, I'm joined by Islamic lecturer Amina Inloz. Thank you so much for being with us. As we have seen, and the clip was telling us about some of the problems that we may have when it comes to understanding Islam. If we start from the very beginning, about Islam and women and divinely rights that are given to women by Islam. You as a Muslim woman, when you look at the scriptural sources and you look at the Muslim majority societies, do you see a gap? And if there is a gap, what are the reasons?
I think this is too big of a question to answer with a simple yes or no. After all, there's over 1 billion Muslims in the world. There's many majority Muslim countries. And even within those countries, people have vastly different experiences. I think most people would agree that the experience of someone who's living in poverty is quite different to the experience of someone who's well off or who's highly educated. And similarly, the situation of women in various strata of society varies quite a bit. So I don't think it's possible to give a clear answer. I would say the answer is yes and no. In some places, I do think women are able to achieve their full human potential. And in some places, I think this is restricted in some manners. And I would say it's the same in the West, too, both for Muslim women and women of other faiths or no faith. There are some ways in which the society allows us to develop our potential, and there are other ways which we might find a hindrance. You might notice, by the way, I'm using the word develop potential instead of right, just because I do think that most of what is broadly conceptualized as human rights, whether it's the right to security or the right to education, is ultimately aimed at helping the human being develop their lifetime potential as a human being, whether it's in terms of their health and their physical security or their intellectual potential, their social contribution, and so forth.
Except that when we speak about rights, we are speaking about the legal framework, then we have to respect, and this has to do with rules. Would you say that there are rules and there is a legal framework, and it's also the dynamics that we call potential?
Well, the discourse of rights in and of itself is its own topic. Nowadays, when we talk about rights, I think we are oftentimes, by implication, referring to documents such as the UN Declaration of Human Rights, of which we agree, as Muslims in traditional Islamic thought, we agree with much of it. There might be some slight divergences here and there, but the essence of it, that human beings should have an inherent right to safety, to fair employment, and so forth. Definitely, I would say we would agree with that. But I think the essence of that sort of approach is something which is beyond a legalistic approach, something that cannot really be legally implemented, as a matter of fact. Whereas if you're talking specifically about legal rights or a court of law, that's a different matter. For example, that might involve equality before the law, or, for example, taking someone to court for giving someone unequal pay, and so forth. But I do think the essence of the question goes beyond what is legalized, and I think that's also part of the problem. I am personally of the view, now you can let me know whether you agree or not, but I'm of the view that many times, or perhaps even most of the time, when women are in a situation where they are deprived of the ability to develop their potential or their free agency and so forth, and deprived of other rights as well, it's usually not just an issue to do with women. It's usually indicative of broader social problems, whether it's poverty or political injustice, some sort of failure of the state. Usually I find that it's associated with some broader injustice in the society, and that's what really needs to be fixed. So, for example, if one of the things listed in the UN Bill of Human Rights or Declaration of Human Rights is that people should have, basically they should have pensions, they should be taken care of by the state. Now, Islamically, we agree with that. We believe the government should step in and provide certain services to the people, theoretically. But if you go to a country where people are starving, then the society does not have the resources necessarily to provide. So in essence, it's not just an issue to do with perceptions of women or cultural perceptions or whatnot, but it's a much bigger issue. And
it's a bigger and it's a more complex discussion, because all what you are saying are elements that we have to take into account. For example, the state of affairs within the society and poverty. So this is exactly what we can bring into the discussion when it comes to our discussion with Muslim interpretation and understanding. Just between brackets, before coming to my question, you were saying there are countries where it's better than other countries. Would you have in mind, for example, is there a country or countries where you think that the gap or the consistency or the faithfulness to the principles and the implementation is better than others in Islamic terms, you would say? Because many Muslims are saying, no, we are wrong everywhere. And you are saying, no, be careful, there are countries or societies where it's better than others. What would you refer to?
Well, I haven't been to every single majority Muslim country in the world, let alone minority Muslim countries, so I can't say.
But studying them, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, based on where I've been and also knowing people from other places, I mean, again, I would say it really varies. You go to a country like Iran, for example, there's a very strong representation of women in the university system. Over half of the students are pursuing higher education. There's a good representation of women in the parliament, so that's something. I've often felt that when you go to Southeast Asia, places like Malaysia and so forth, some of the cultural and traditional obstacles towards women's agency, I don't think they're quite as strong. I think historically there's...
As in the Arab world, for example.
In the Gulf states, I would say the social perception of women is quite different from what I understand from these regions. Of course, again, individual people vary. So that's a different situation. You go somewhere like...
yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, when you could name place after place after place.
Yes.
For example, in Lebanon, I've met a lot of very strong women. And I think that probably has to do with the fact that because of the conflict there, a lot of women do have to shoulder a lot of responsibility on themselves, especially in South Lebanon.
Being more assertive in the social ground.
Definitely very assertive. Of course, I do think women in general are strong throughout the world. We may be perceived as weak, but women have to do very difficult things, such as bear children. And women tend to have to undergo a lot of patience and a lot of hardship and a lot of sacrifice. So I do think there's strong women everywhere. That being said, I have noticed some particularly strong women in South Lebanon. And again, every country you could say something.
Okay, if we now, from the realities, to try to understand why in some societies now we can see that, contrary to what Islam is teaching us about, the women's potential and equal before God, having the right to a social presence, even a political presence. Why do we have this gap? What are, according to you, the reasons explaining why do we have such Islamic principles and sometimes such a distorted way of implementing these principles?
Again, I think this is a complex issue. But if you want my personal opinion, and I suspect you do because you just asked me the question, I think a fair amount of this relates to the way we've had to respond to modernity in the past 100 years, maybe even 50 years. The entire world has gone through tremendous social change. I mean, with the exception of some people who are living in very remote regions, a lot of the world has undergone a lot of urbanization, spread of all sorts of things, mass communication, and so forth. And it takes people a while to adjust to this sort of thing. And I think with regards to majority Muslim countries, which have tended to be the sources for a lot of Islamic discourse, I think in part some of this is due to a sense of reactionism against perceived Western imperialization or cultural colonization. In that, and it is true, this is, I think, a fair accusation. There are many people in the West, I don't like to generalize the West, but Western Europe and the United States also, who have used women's issues to attack majority Muslim countries, even straightforwardly. Bush, for example, using freeing Afghani women as one of the justifications for invading Afghanistan. And we see the same thing throughout the Islamic world for the past 100, 200 years. And so therefore, as a sort of response in many majority Muslim societies, there's been this sense that, no, the West is saying women and men are equal, so therefore we have to fight the West by making women less equal, so to speak. So I think it is, in some cases, a sort of reactionism, which we see in other places throughout the world.
Would you add a cultural factor? Because what we have, it's, and this is what we can see with Western Muslim women, they are in a context when they can see that sometimes what they get as explanation to Islam is much more cultural than Islamic. So the cultural factor is important, isn't it?
To be honest, I am not entirely sure. In that, when you read back a few hundred years back into Islamic history, it seems that there was a bit less sensitivity about a lot of the issues we have today. For example, there are women working in the sciences, women doctors, women Islamic scholars. You go back to the great medieval Islamic scholars, many of them had female teachers. It wasn't really an issue for anyone. Women would attend lectures and so forth in the mosques. Even some of the stigmas we have today about women remarrying, for example, after a divorce and so forth. Pardon me. Of course, I'm not promoting divorce, but we all know in some countries among Muslims, it's very difficult for ladies to remarry. These don't seem to have been issues before the pre-modern era in general. Now, I'm not saying they weren't issues anywhere, because there were many peoples in the pre-modern era, but it seems things were a bit different. And so I do suspect some of the conservatism we see today is a reaction to the geopolitical situation of the 19th and 20th centuries. But yes, of course.
You wouldn't say that the patriarchal cultures have an impact in the way, for example, we read the scriptural sources?
Yes, I would say it definitely has an impact. I just think it was a bit more complex. And I think the fact that you do find authors, say, in the 13th century or the 15th century, who are sort of complaining that things aren't as patriarchal as they would like, indicates that women had a different sort of voice in that era, or a different sort of presence. Whereas nowadays, I do think in the past century, many women did lose that voice, particularly in the Islamic discourse. Although I would add, I do think it's been changing in the past couple decades. And in particular, with the advent of satellite television, I've noticed that there are a lot of Muslim women who are able to give their own views on various Islamic issues, whether it's Islamic law or social issues or this discussion that we're having right now. And I think it really has opened up a platform for Muslim women to be able to contribute to the dialogue with regards to whatever perspective they may have.
But if we go a step further than that and we ask ourselves what they should do, because there is a sense, of this discrimination towards women. This is a motto that is coming from the West, repeated, and this is why you have problem. We can see, about the visibility of Muslim, the headscarf is becoming a problem. Recently, we had in France the interior minister saying, this is a struggle, this should be our focus to free women from the headscarf, because this is the very essence of alienation. So he's not touching the cultural, he's touching the essence of, not the essence as the priority, but some principles that are perceived by Muslims as principles of their practice, and not only something which is cultural, that you can decide yes and no. So with all this happening now, what could be what can we promote from within, something which is a critical, constructive Islamic discourse, versus sometimes what some are doing in the name of Islam and the way the West sometimes is perceiving Islam and reducing Islam to something which is discrimination towards women?
I think when it comes to women's issues specifically, because we do have plenty of problems in the Muslim world, mashallah, one of the easiest things we can do is simply to allow women to have a voice. Sometimes women's perspectives on their own experiences are quite different to how our male counterparts might perceive them, and sometimes they're quite
like
similar.
What? Can you be just give us some examples on that?
Well, as I mentioned right now, for example, the advent of women, Muslim women, practicing Muslim women on television, has added a new dimension to the discussion.
But a voice should they have a voice only when it comes to speak about women, or a voice on?
No, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, one of the things that annoys me tremendously is whether we look in terms of an Islamic context, so to speak, or even in the university when it comes to Islamic studies, most of the time women are only asked to discuss women's issues or feminism. For example, I was at a very nice seminar last year, a 2-week seminar. It was, very well done, and they had a number of women speakers. It was a seminar on Islamic studies and Muslim experiences. However, all of the women were discussing Islamic feminism. And fine, so someone wants to discuss it, that's fine. It's a subject of study. But women are capable of discussing a broad range of subjects. And we do find that within the Muslim world, there are women who are experts in all sorts of fields, medicine, the sciences, and so forth. But when it comes to religion, I agree there is a tendency to keep women in a certain area of thought. This may simply be due to I don't want to say ignorance, but perhaps it not occurring to people that women might have something to say about usul al-fiqh, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic history, politics, literature, whatnot. But I do think this is something that's also good to go beyond. I also think that as Muslims specifically, it's good to try to up the level of our discussion a bit. Fortunately, I think in the past century, again, we've been able to resolve a number of social problems. You go back 100 years anywhere in the world. For example, mass education wasn't really available to most people, or if it was, not at a very advanced level. Nowadays, mass education is largely available to a lot of men and women. Of course, in some places, this still needs improvement. But I'm saying there are certain things that were problems, say, 50 years ago, that aren't really issues so much today. So, for example, going to the university is not usually such a problem for women because they're women. It might be a problem for financial reasons or some other reason, but not necessarily simply because women happen to be females. So I think we should move on from these sorts of discussions and perhaps look more at how the dialogue itself is being framed, and to look at the bigger issues. For example, because I know you were going to ask an example, I was very happy when we began this program and you didn't ask me, or someone didn't ask me, are Muslim women being given their rights? A lot of times we are asked questions like this. And the fact is, if you have to ask whether group X is being given their rights, the answer is no. Because when someone is in a position where you can decide whether or not to give them their rights, they don't have any sort of control. And so I think we need to look at taking women or any other disempowered group out of the position of being an object, so to speak, in society, whereby one portion of society can decide whether or not they get their rights, and moving ahead to making it a situation where disempowered groups are empowered in a healthy way.
That's a very important point. What you are saying is that very often we start the discussion about rights and discriminations, but in fact the starting point is much beyond that. It's the whole being a subject before being an object within the discussion, and I think that you are making a very important point. A last question, and if you can try to respond to this in a very, very focused way. What we have now in the clip we saw this is some women sometimes are discriminated by states that are in fact referring sometimes to Islam or instrumentalizing Islam. Even in society where they are completely secular, they will use Islam to target women in the name of Islam where the state has nothing to do with this. So what should be the attitude, social and political attitude, of women when it comes to this? Because this is we are dealing with power, we are dealing with authority, and we need to get this understanding of how should be this presence and this acknowledgement that women are subject.
I think to give a focused answer or a short answer, again, is quite difficult because I can't really say what is best for people in every single country. I mean, in some countries, for example, people obtain their rights by protesting. Sometimes it's by leading an uprising. I'm not suggesting that women should lead an uprising. I'm just giving an example here. You know, in some places it's through education or through social education. Sometimes the government even makes an effort to try to change the views of the masses. So every country has its own situation. But I think the best thing we can do is simply raise awareness of these and other issues and try to promote reform in a healthy manner. And I do think education has a big thing to do with it as well.
Thank you so much. I think that in this discussion what was important, and you started like this, and I think we have to make it clear that the situation is not a simple situation. The situations are very complex depending on the countries, that we have to be very specific when it comes to this. Still, we can see crossing the board and crossing the countries, we can see that there are often discrepancy between the Islamic principles and what is happening on the ground for many reasons. And what you said is one of the main reasons is the Muslim majority countries are sometimes reactive to the West, and then they come to something which is a much more defensive approach on this, while we can also add the cultural aspect that sometimes could play a role and others. And at the end, the best would be much more education, and what you kept on repeating, which is essential, is for the women to be subject and to be vocal and heard in their struggle, because this is also something which is important in the future improvement of the situation. Well, that's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows we have seen, and here is the way to contact us.
Islam and Life welcomes your opinion. So please send us your suggestions as well as criticism on any of the shows you have seen or you would like to see. You can do all this by emailing us at islamandlife@presstv.co.uk. You can also be part of our online platform by joining our Facebook page, Islam and Life on Press TV, where you can share your thoughts with other Islam and Life fans, engage with debate and view past shows.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Amina Inloz. Thank you so much for your presence and your input. And I hope to see you next week, inshallah.